Good evening, my friend, and wherever in the world you are listening from tonight, I hope the hour is kind to you. Maybe it is late where you are. Maybe the room is quiet. Maybe you are listening under a blanket, half awake, half somewhere else already. And if you feel like it, you can leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always like imagining these stories drifting out into different nights, into different rooms, into different little corners of the world where someone should probably be asleep by now, but isn't quite ready yet. Tonight, we are going to spend some time in a place where people also slept lightly. Not because they were especially nervous people by nature, not because they were dramatic, not because they enjoyed waking up at every distant sound in the trees, but because in the old Baltic lands, long before borders became neat and respectable, and governments began pretending that maps had always made sense, life had a habit of remaining temporary for far longer than anyone wanted. A fence was temporary, a refuge was temporary, a promise was temporary, a fort was temporary, even a conversion could be temporary, which is a fairly awkward thing to say about religion, though the Middle Ages had a remarkable ability to make even eternity feel negotiable. And so a great deal of life in these lands was lived under the assumption that almost everything had to do two jobs. A thing had to be useful for today, and it had to be ready to save your life tomorrow. A hill was not just a hill if it could be fortified. A horse was not just a horse if it could also carry away your family, your grain, and your pride after a raid. A grove was not just a grove if it was sacred, and also a place where people remembered how to hide. And that is one of the strange, slow truths of this whole world. The Baltic Tribal Wars were not only about fighting, they were about what happened to ordinary life, when ordinary life was never allowed to remain ordinary for very long. A house, for example, was a house. That sounds obvious, and it should. A house was where smoke collected in the rafters, where clothing dried badly in damp weather, where bread or porridge or broth was prepared, where tools were repaired, where people argued quietly because there were always too many people too close together and not enough room for anyone's full personality. It was where a child might sleep near the warmth, where a woman might sort grain or mend cloth, where a man might come in carrying mud and inconvenience, and the look of someone who had been thinking about a broken fence all afternoon. But in a frontier world, a house was also a calculation. How quickly could you leave it? How much could you carry? What had to stay? What would burn first? And how far was the nearest place that might still be standing if yours was not? This is where the mind begins to change, very slowly, and a people begin living inside contingency without calling it that. Nobody would have sat around saying, "We are now developing a culture of chronic insecurity." People rarely describe their own misery in such polished language. They just get used to doing slightly unreasonable things. They sleep lightly, they keep things near the door, they listen for dogs, they remember paths through the trees, they know which child runs fast and which one has to be carried. They know how much grain can be hidden and how much simply has to be risked. And that is how a temporary habit becomes a way of life. Not by design, not because it is elegant, but because repeating the same emergency long enough makes it feel normal. This happened with hills. At first, a hill is simply high ground, which people everywhere have admired because it is dry and a little superior, and makes the people below seem as if they have made poor choices. Then there is trouble. Or rather, there is always trouble, but now it comes often enough that the hill begins to collect purpose. Earth is moved, timber is raised, a ditch is cut. Maybe not because anyone imagines a grand fortress, maybe only because raiders have become tiresome, and because the thought of seeing one's grain, one's children, one's goats, and one's future, carried off by men from the next district, has begun to feel repetitive. So, a little fortification is added, only for safety, only for now, only until the danger passes. The danger, naturally, refuses to cooperate. And this is how the Baltic world keeps hardening around ordinary inconvenience. A hilltop refuge, built because people are tired of being interrupted, becomes a local center. Then a stronger refuge. Then a place where supplies are stored. Then a place where a leader can gather men. Then a place where, in bad years, too many people crowd together, breathing fear and smoke and animal smell, waiting to see whether the attackers will leave or whether the walls will catch first. You can feel the irony already. People build a temporary refuge because life has become unstable. Then the refuge itself becomes part of the structure of life. It must be repaired, stocked, watched, remembered. Paths lead to it. Stories cling to it. Children grow up knowing not just where home is, but where the other home is, the one that is used when the world behaves as it usually does. And this becomes one of the quiet engines of the Baltic Tribal Wars. The strange partnership between ordinary settlement and emergency settlement, the farm below, the refuge above, the daily life and the backup life, the peaceful routine and the version of peace that carries a spear. It is tempting to imagine that people would have hated this arrangement every single day, and I am sure they often did. But human beings are suspiciously adaptable. Give us a burden long enough, and we begin decorating it mentally. We give it customs, we give it expectations, we explain it to children as if it had always been there. We become experts in our own inconvenience. Someone would have known when to move animals upward. Someone would have known where the spare tools were kept. Someone would have known which old boards needed replacing. Someone would have muttered that the gate always sticks in wet weather and nobody fixes it properly. This is medieval life in one of its least glamorous forms. Not banners, not speeches, just a defensive gate that still does not close properly because everyone has been too busy surviving to improve it. And while all this is happening, life at ground level keeps insisting on itself. Fields still need work. Grain does not care that politics are unstable. Hay does not gather itself. A fence broken by weather still has to be mended, even if a neighbor might. Raid next month. Children continue being born at inconvenient times. People continue growing hungry with unbelievable regularity. And so war does not arrive in a separate compartment. It seeps into the routine. That is what makes this world different from the clean, dramatic way later people like to imagine warfare. The Baltic frontier was not a place where life happened, and then occasionally war interrupted it. War was folded into the shape of life so thoroughly that a person could spend the morning repairing a tool, the afternoon checking on animals, and the evening discussing whether the nearby district had become too quiet to be trusted. Quiet, in such places, was often suspicious. Too much peace meant someone was planning something. Too much movement meant someone was planning something. Too little movement also meant someone was planning something. This was not an ideal environment for relaxation, but it was perfect for the development of habits that lasted much longer than intended. A warning route through the woods, for instance, might begin as local knowledge. Just a practical path. Just a way to move unseen if riders appear. Then more people use it. Then everyone knows it. Then it becomes part of the invisible architecture of the community. The map on the ground remains simple. The map in people's heads becomes much more complicated. Open path, hidden path, marsh route, winter route, route for cattle, route for children, route for carrying what matters, route for leaving behind what does not. And one day, someone who never meant to become important becomes important simply because he knows which way to go in the dark. This is another quiet truth of the Baltic lands. Leadership did not emerge only from bloodline or wealth or splendid speeches delivered on horseback. Sometimes authority emerged because a man could organize retreat, because he could judge risk, because he could gather people fast enough, because in a world of repeated emergencies, competence acquires a sacred glow. Of course, competence is not the same thing as kindness. The man who can protect a district may also become the man who expects obedience. The hill fort that saves the community may also become the place where the community must now serve. The store of shared grain may become the reserve, controlled by whoever commands the walls. And so the emergency produces hierarchy. The temporary leader becomes a lasting leader. The protector becomes a collector of loyalties, then of gifts, then perhaps of tribute. This is how politics often begins in such places, not with abstract theories, but with repeated need. People gather around the one who can manage danger. He asks for a little more, then a little more. Then eventually everyone pretends this arrangement was natural all along, which it wasn't. Almost nothing in this story is natural in that sense. It is improvised, repeated, hardened, blessed by necessity, then remembered as tradition. And because this is human history, somebody somewhere will certainly insist that the old ways had always been the old ways. Even when half the old ways were invented during the last 3 emergencies, the same thing happened with storing food. A household keeps grain because households do not enjoy starving. Another portion is hidden because raiders exist. Another portion is moved because the local refuge must be provisioned. Another portion is held back because nobody trusts the coming season. Eventually, this creates not just prudence, but a culture of layered caution. Food is no longer simply food. It is a timetable. It is an argument with winter. It is a secret. It is a gamble placed against men with horses. And food has a way of exposing the true absurdity of war. Great causes sound impressive. Spiritual struggles sound elevated. Territorial disputes sound important to men who own nice seals and enjoy dictating letters. But down at the level of ordinary life, a conflict often reveals itself in very plain terms. There is less grain than there should be. There are fewer animals than there were. The fence remains broken longer. The people are tired earlier in the year. A widow appears where there was none. A child stops asking when a father is coming back, because the child has understood before the adults were ready to say it aloud. That is the ground texture of this world, and still life goes on. In fact, life becomes stubborn in direct proportion to how often it is threatened. Bread is made, clothing is mended, animals are coaxed through difficult seasons. Someone complains, someone jokes. Someone falls in love in a place that would not survive a proper audit. Someone is born into a district where the walls above the village are already old, already repaired too many times, already full of memory. This is why the Baltic Tribal Wars are best understood not as a chain of famous battles, but as a long habit of preparedness settling into the bones of a people. A hill becomes a fort becomes an expectation becomes a custom becomes a burden becomes identity. And once that happens, even peace does not fully undo it. Because if a generation has learned to live with a second life stored uphill, with a second plan in the woods, with a second thought behind every promise, then peace arrives like an outsider. It feels almost impolite. It asks too much trust too quickly. And trust in these lands was expensive. It was expensive between neighbors, expensive between districts, expensive between tribes, and eventually very expensive indeed between pagans, merchants, missionaries, bishops, and men who arrived claiming to solve temporary problems forever, which is always a dangerous thing to say, because forever has a habit of marching in wearing boots, asking only for a little cooperation, and then somehow requiring land, labor, taxes, obedience, roads, hostages, and a chapel. But that comes later. For now, it is enough to remain here for a little while longer, in the half-light below the hill, where the ordinary and the defensive still live side by side, where people work because they must, prepare because they must, and learn without ever writing it down that the most permanent things in life often begin as reluctant improvisations, and somewhere above them, on packed earth and timber, the refuge waits, not grandly, not heroically, just patiently, like a second heartbeat. If a house could become a calculation, then a path could become a secret. And in the Baltic lands, secrets had a way of becoming public eventually, though usually only after somebody unfortunate had bled on them first. A path, in the beginning, is just a path. It is the place where feet have gone often enough to admit that they prefer convenience. It is a line formed by repetition and mild laziness, and the very human desire not to crash through brush every time one needs to carry something heavy. It leads from the house to the field, from the field to the water, from the settlement to the pasture, from one person's stubborn little world to another person's equally stubborn little world. But that is only how paths begin. In lands where danger is frequent and clarity is unwise, paths do not remain innocent for very long. Soon there is the ordinary path, the fast path, the muddy path, the winter path, the path that works only when the ground is frozen, the path that cannot be used after rain, the path that children know, the path children are told not to mention, the path for driving animals, the path for carrying sacks, and the path for leaving in a hurry without looking as though one is leaving in a hurry. This is the sort of complexity that never appears properly on a map, and yet it may matter more than any border, because a border is a statement, a path is survival, and survival, as we have already begun to notice, is one of those things that likes to start modestly and then stay forever. A man might begin by learning one hidden route because raiders passed near the main clearing one bad autumn. That makes sense. Sensible, even, temporary, not a philosophy, just practical caution. He remembers where the ground stays firm between wet places. He remembers the line of trees that shields movement. He notices that if you keep a certain stand of alder on your left and a fallen trunk to your right, you come out behind higher ground where smoke cannot be seen so easily. Then next season, someone else uses that route. Then in winter it changes, because the bog hardens and the dangerous place becomes the easy place. Then the children learn it, because children learn everything adults wish they would not. Then, a generation later, no one remembers when it first became important. It simply is important. It has entered that quiet realm where improvisation becomes tradition, and tradition begins glaring at everyone as if it had always been there. This happens constantly in difficult places. People do not gather and announce, "We are now formalizing the emergency footpath." They just keep using it until forgetting becomes impossible. The Baltic world was full of this kind of invisible architecture. A stranger might see only trees. A local person would see options. A stranger might see marsh. A local person would see delay, cover, death, escape, and depending on the season, perhaps even an excellent shortcut. This is one of the great jokes of landscape. The same stretch of ground can be either useless or precious depending on whether you know it well enough, and in the Baltic tribal world, knowing ground was almost a form of wealth. Not the sort you could hang from your belt to impress anyone at a feast, which is probably why some men took far too long to appreciate it. But real wealth, all the same, to know where horses could pass in spring, to know which ford became treacherous after rain, to know where reeds concealed movement, to know how far a group with children could go before panic, became slower than fear. These were not poetic insights. They were the sort of facts people learned because the alternative was absurdly unpleasant. And so the landscape entered the mind, not as scenery, but as memory arranged for future use. One can imagine the quiet arrogance of the man who knows such things well. There is always one, the man who does not speak much when others are boasting, but who becomes indispensable the moment everyone realizes that the obvious route is impossible, and that perhaps this is not the hour for pride. Suddenly, the boastful men turn toward him. Suddenly, the person who remembered where the ground remains solid matters more than the person who owns the shiniest weapon. It must have been annoying for some of them. This is another way temporary needs reshape society. A community under threat begins to value a different type of intelligence, not only courage, not only strength, not even only loyalty, though people always say they value loyalty until the situation becomes complicated and they discover that loyalty without competence is mostly decorative. No, what begins to matter is practical memory, the sort of mind that stores the world usefully. The irony, of course, is that such knowledge is difficult to centralize. A lord may command men. A bishop may issue demands. A war leader may call followers to arms. But the person who really knows how to move through the wet forest in failing light, without losing a horse and two cousins, remains a kind of local treasure. And this creates one of the many inefficiencies that haunt the Baltic frontier. Larger powers want control. Control prefers neat systems. But the land keeps insisting on local expertise. This means conquest is never as simple as taking a place. One must also learn it. And learning it often requires depending on the very people one hopes eventually to dominate an awkward arrangement. It gets worse when routes become known to enemies, because a hidden path is a wonderful thing until somebody talks. Perhaps a captive escapes. Perhaps a neighbor defects. Perhaps a local ally grows resentful. Perhaps someone marries badly and decides that revenge should include geography. However it happens, the private map leaks. Now the path that once meant safety means exposure, so a new path must be found. A backup for the backup. A second secrecy for the first secrecy. This is how long conflict teaches people to live in layers. Nothing is ever the only plan. This layered thinking does peculiar things to a society. It makes people cautious. It also makes them patient in a specific, slightly menacing way. They become used to waiting, to watching movement, to treating silence as information. A peaceful road is not always reassuring. Sometimes it merely means the raid is using another road, and so even travel becomes an argument with uncertainty. A short journey to exchange goods or visit kin can never be entirely ordinary. One wonders who has passed recently. One wonders whether the nearby district is hungry enough, angry enough, or simply bored enough to behave badly. One wonders whether the visible path is safer than the hidden one, or whether that is exactly what someone wants one to think. This is what prolonged frontier life does. It does not merely create fear. Fear comes and goes. It creates habits of interpretation. The world becomes full of signs, possible intentions, and remembered inconveniences. A broken branch may mean nothing. It may also mean riders. Smoke may mean supper. It may also mean that someone else's supper is now burning in a less useful way. And because human beings are impossible, even here, humor survives. There must have been people who complained that the supposedly secret route had become so well known that even old women and goats used it. People always become sarcastic the moment emergency becomes routine. It is our little rebellion against necessity. The hidden route becomes the familiar route. The familiar route becomes crowded. The crowded route becomes dangerous. The dangerous route becomes unavoidable. And then someone says, in the tone of a person who has lost the strength to be impressed anymore, that perhaps next time the raiders might kindly arrange themselves by appointment. One should never underestimate the role of irritation in history. A great many institutions are built not only from fear, but from people becoming tired of the same problem. This is how raiding begins to shape life, even before the raiders appear. You repair with theft in mind. You store with theft in mind. You travel with theft in mind. You marry with theft in mind. You trust with theft in mind. And once that habit settles in, the distinction between peace and preparation begins to blur. A field may look peaceful, but if the animals are kept close enough to be moved quickly, if the grain is divided in more than one place, if the children already know where to run, then peace is no longer simple peace. It is merely the absence of immediate interruption. That is a very different condition, and it helps explain why the Baltic Tribal Wars took the shapes they did. Because in such lands, warfare is not only about set battles, it is about mobility, about knowing when to appear, when to vanish, when to strike fast, and when to leave with something that matters more than honor. A sack of grain, a drove of cattle, 3 horses, 2 captives. 1 insult repaid. It sounds small when listed plainly, which is precisely why it matters. History likes to dress itself in grand clothing. But real damage is usually practical. A captured noble is important, yes. A stolen horse is also important. A burned storehouse may be more important than either, depending on the month. And now, almost without noticing, we come to the most ordinary and miserable luxury in all of this world: animals. To own animals is to own food, labor, movement, status, and anxiety. Cattle are wealth that breathe. Horses are prestige that eat constantly. Pigs are useful until they become someone else's pigs. Sheep are patience wrapped in wool. And goats, as usual, seem to have been created specifically to remind human beings that ownership is only a suggestion. In a raid frontier, animals acquire an even stranger quality. They are not just wealth, they are portable wealth, which means they are perfect targets. It is one thing to seize land in theory. It is quite another to drive off a living herd before anyone can stop you. A man who steals grain takes food. A man who steals cattle takes future food, labor, status, and sometimes a family's chance of surviving the year without humiliation. This is why so much frontier violence seems repetitive. Because it is repetitive, people attack what can be taken, moved, hidden, eaten, traded, displayed, or ransomed again and again. The same problems return because the same things matter. One district raids another and drives off animals. Retaliation follows. Not always immediately. Timing matters. Harvest matters. Weather matters. Pride matters most when it is least convenient. But eventually someone answers. Because not answering encourages repetition, and repetition is intolerable unless one is the person benefiting from it. So raiding becomes communication, crude communication, exhausting communication, but very clear: you took from us. We can take from you. You are weak. No, you are weak. You crossed here. we can cross there. And over time, this creates not only conflict, but a culture of expectation around conflict. People learn what kind of insult requires an answer. They learn how much loss can be endured before a leader appears ridiculous. They learn that generosity after a successful raid can bind followers more tightly than speeches ever will. A chief who returns with cattle, captives, metal goods, or horses is not just victorious. He is distributive. He can reward. He can feast. He can appear capable in the one language that matters most in an unstable world: visible results. And so here again, something temporary thickens into structure. A raid begins as an act. Then it becomes a habit, then a source of status, then almost a political necessity. A leader who does not provide looks weak. A follower who is not rewarded grows restless. A community that cannot retaliate becomes tempting. It is all terribly circular, which is one reason it lasts. There is also an absurd social truth hidden inside raiding. War makes men important, yes, but only because households keep functioning somewhere behind them. Animals do not magically return themselves to pens. Grain does not dry itself. Tools are not repaired by heroic memory. The people who remain in settlement spaces, women, older kin, children old enough to work, perhaps injured men, perhaps slaves or dependents, carry a silent burden every time a military venture begins. If the raid succeeds, everyone celebrates the daring. If the raid fails, everyone absorbs the damage. This is one of history's oldest and least surprising arrangements. Yet, even success is complicated. Imagine the practical irritation of suddenly having more animals to manage because the raid went well. More mouths, more noise, more need for fodder, more decisions about division, more arguments about whose courage was truly decisive, and therefore whose share should be less insulting than the others. Human beings can turn good fortune into paperwork, even without paper. Then there are captives, a grim subject, but an unavoidable one. In frontier societies, captives are not side notes. They are labor, leverage, profit, humiliation, replacement population, ransom, memory, and warning. To take a captive is not only to remove a person, it is to rearrange households. Someone is lost here. Someone appears there. A family waits. Another family adjusts. A child learns new words. A woman is absorbed, traded, married, or mourned incorrectly. A man may be ransomed if he matters, worked if he does not, killed if circumstances sour, or occasionally escape and return carrying the very information that will guide the next retaliation. And this creates one of the darker jokes of the Baltic world. People themselves become paths. They carry knowledge across enemy lines. They take secrets into new households. They remember entrances, stores, weaknesses, quarrels. A captive is tragedy, but also intelligence in human form. This is one reason trust remains costly for so long. Every raid leaves behind more than damage. It leaves behind memory in motion. And by now, we can begin to feel the shape of the frontier more clearly. The forest does not simply conceal, it stores intentions. The road does not simply connect, it exposes. The hidden path does not simply save, it may betray later. The horse does not simply carry, it tempts theft. The hill fort does not simply defend, it attracts obligation. The leader does not simply protect, he accumulates expectation. Everything acquires a second purpose. Everything becomes slightly double. That doubleness is the true atmosphere of the Baltic Tribal Wars. Not merely violence, not merely pagan against Christian, tribe against tribe, district against district, but a world where every useful thing gradually develops another use under pressure. and where people become so accustomed to this that they scarcely notice when living temporarily has become their permanent condition. Soon enough, this same pattern will reach farther than local raids. It will reach roads used by merchants, rivers used by missionaries, harbors used by men who claim to come for trade and salvation, and somehow keep arriving with timber, armed escorts, legal claims, and pious expressions, which is always suspicious. But before those larger troubles settle in, it is worth lingering here a little longer among the smaller ones, among the hoofprints, among the narrow crossings, among the hidden ways through wet ground, among people who have not yet been conquered, not exactly, but who have already been shaped by the possibility of being reached. Because once a people begin keeping more of the world in their heads than on the ground, once they begin dividing life into the visible way and the real way, they are already living in history's tightening grip, even if all they wanted, at first, was a safer way home. There is something very comforting about a river, at least there is at first. It moves in one direction, it suggests purpose. It carries things away, which is a quality people tend to admire when they are tired of carrying those same things themselves. It reflects light in a way that makes the world look more organized than it really is. And if you stand beside it long enough, you begin to feel that perhaps life too could be arranged into something that flows, something that makes sense, something that does not constantly require you to check over your shoulder. This is, of course, an illusion. But it is a pleasant illusion, and so people return to it often. In the Baltic lands, rivers were never just scenery. They were not even just water. They were decisions. They were routes. They were invitations, though not always the sort of invitation one intended to send. At first, a river is simply useful. It shortens distance. It spares effort. It allows goods to move more easily than through stubborn forest and uncooperative ground. A log floats more willingly than it walks. A sack of grain prefers a boat to a back. A person who must travel long distances learns quickly that water, when it behaves, is a kind of kindness. So people use the river only when necessary, only for convenience, only until something better appears. Nothing better appears. Instead, more people use the river. Then more people who are not from here begin to use the river. And this is where usefulness begins to change its character, because a path through the forest can remain local for a long time. It can stay hidden, remembered only by those who need it. A river cannot do this. A river advertises itself. It is a visible promise. It says, without meaning to say anything at all, if you follow me, you will find something worth reaching. And so someone follows it, then someone else, then men who are not from this land, who do not know the names of the trees, who do not understand why one patch of ground is avoided while another is trusted, who have no childhood memory tied to these waters, but who recognize opportunity with the same clarity that anyone recognizes a full table. They come for trade. Of course they do. Trade is always the beginning, because trade is polite. Trade does not demand explanation. Trade does not announce ambition. It arrives carrying goods and reasonable intentions, and the faint suggestion that everyone might benefit from behaving sensibly. And for a while, this is true. Furs move, wax moves, honey moves, metal goods arrive, strange objects appear, objects that feel important even when no one is entirely sure why. The presence of distant places begins to gather quietly in the shape of things. A buckle, a blade, a piece of cloth, a tool that seems slightly better than the old one. These are small changes, but small changes have a way of opening doors in the mind. If someone far away can make this, what else might they make? If they have this, what else might they want? If they want something, what will they do to get it? Questions like these do not arrive all at once. They settle slowly, like mist, and for a time they can be ignored. Trade is useful. The river is useful. People have always preferred useful things, but usefulness has a habit of attracting attention, and attention, once it arrives, rarely leaves empty-handed. The men who travel these rivers begin to notice patterns, where people gather, where goods are stored, where movement is easy, where movement is difficult, which settlements appear strong, which appear tired, which leaders seem respected, which seem uncertain. And this is where something subtle begins to change, because trade is not only the movement of goods, it is the movement of knowledge. And knowledge, unlike grain or cattle, is difficult to count once it begins to spread. A merchant does not need to conquer a place to understand it. He only needs to pass through it often enough. He learns where the river bends dangerously. He learns where boats must slow. He learns where men become visible against open ground. He learns where there are too many dogs, which is always a sign that people are attentive. He learns where there are too few, which is always a sign that something is wrong. And because human beings are consistent in their inconsistency, he also learns that no place is entirely safe, and no place is entirely foolish. This kind of knowledge accumulates quietly. No one celebrates it. No one builds a hill fort for it. No one sings about it at a feast. But it becomes valuable, more valuable than it should be. And eventually, someone else begins to use it. Because merchants do not travel alone forever. Soon they are accompanied. At first, this is practical. The river is not safe. There are raiders. There are opportunists. There are men who believe that a boat full of goods is simply a slower version of a herd of cattle. So protection is needed. Only temporary protection. Only until the route is safer. Only until things settle. Things do not settle. And so the protection remains. And because protection costs something, arrangements must be made. A small fee, a favour, a promise, an understanding. Nothing formal, nothing permanent. Just a little structure to ensure that useful things continue to be useful. And this is where the river begins to change again, because now it is not only a path, it is a system. Goods move, men move, protection moves with them. Expectations form. If a route is used often enough, it becomes reliable. If it becomes reliable, people depend on it. If people depend on it, it becomes important. If it becomes important, someone will claim it. This is one of those quiet laws that does not need to be written down. Anything that matters will eventually be owned, controlled, taxed, or defended. Usually, all four. And so, along the river, small places begin to grow. Not cities, not yet, just gathering points. Places where goods are exchanged, where boats are repaired, where people wait, where news is shared in the casual, half-interested way that people share news when they are not yet aware that the news will matter more later. A man hears that strangers have been seen further upstream. Another hears that a settlement further downriver has become less welcoming. Someone mentions that a group from another region now passes through more often than before. No one makes a great declaration, but everyone remembers, and remembering is how change begins. Eventually, someone more organized arrives. He does not arrive alone, he does not arrive quietly, but he does arrive with a certain confidence, the kind that comes from believing that the world can be improved through structure. Perhaps he is a bishop. Perhaps he is sent by someone who writes letters with seals. Perhaps he carries a message that sounds reasonable enough that people here might benefit from guidance, from order, from connection to something larger, something more stable, something that promises to replace uncertainty with a better kind of uncertainty. This is often how it is presented. And, in fairness, it is not entirely false. Structure can be useful, protection can be useful, trade can be useful, faith can be useful. The problem is not that these things are lies. The problem is that they do not remain small. A man arrives to help organize trade. He needs protection. Protection requires men. Men require food. Food requires supply. Supply requires storage. Storage requires walls. Walls require maintenance. Maintenance requires labor. Labor requires obligation. Obligation requires authority. Authority requires recognition. Recognition requires enforcement. And suddenly, without anyone quite deciding that this should happen, the river has changed again. It is no longer simply a route used by locals. It is a corridor of interest, a place where multiple intentions overlap, a place where temporary arrangements begin to harden. This is where the discomfort begins. Not dramatic discomfort, not the sort that produces immediate rebellion, just the slow, creeping realization that something has shifted, that the river no longer belongs only to those who have always used it, that decisions are being made elsewhere, that promises are being interpreted differently by different people, that what was once an exchange is becoming a system, and systems have expectations. You can feel it in small things first, a request that feels less like a request, a payment that feels less optional, a presence that lingers longer than necessary, a structure that remains after the original need has passed. And still, life continues. People adjust. They always do. They work around inconvenience. They negotiate. They complain quietly. They accept what they must. They resist where they can. They tell themselves that this, too, is temporary, that things will return to how they were, that the river will once again be simply a river. But rivers, once changed, rarely return to their earlier simplicity, because knowledge has already moved, because expectations have already formed, because someone, somewhere, has decided that this usefulness should be made permanent. And permanence, once it begins to grow, is difficult to uproot, even if it started as nothing more than a helpful boat on a quiet stretch of water. There is a particular kind of man who appears whenever a situation becomes inconvenient enough. Not the kind who caused the inconvenience, which would at least be honest. Not the kind who suffers quietly from it, which would be respectable, but the kind who arrives and says, in a tone of calm confidence, that things could be improved, not dramatically, not violently, just improved. It is a reassuring sort of voice, measured, reasonable, slightly patient, as though the speaker has already solved this problem elsewhere and is mildly surprised that it still exists here. And in the Baltic lands, after enough years of trade along the rivers, after enough small arrangements, after enough temporary protections that never quite ended, these men began to arrive more frequently. They did not come alone. That would have been unwise. They came with companions. At first, only a few, enough to be noticed, but not enough to feel threatening, enough to suggest that this was not a visit, but also not yet an occupation. And they came with a simple idea. The river needs protection. The traders need safety. The routes need to be secured. The people, naturally, would benefit from stability. This was, in a narrow sense, correct. Stability is pleasant. Safety is convenient. Predictability is a luxury that people tend to appreciate once they have experienced enough uncertainty to understand its absence. So the idea is accepted, cautiously, reluctantly, but accepted. Because in a world where paths are hidden, animals are stolen, and sleep is light, even the promise of something more reliable carries weight. And so the first arrangement is made. A few men stay, only temporarily, only to ensure that things improve, only until the situation becomes manageable. Again, the situation does not become manageable, it rarely does, and so the men remain. And because they remain, they must be supported. And because they must be supported, someone must decide how. And because someone must decide how, authority begins to take shape. Not loudly, not officially, just practically. Who provides food? Who maintains the structure? Who answers when something goes wrong? Who is responsible? Responsibility is one of those things that seems harmless until it becomes continuous. Once someone is responsible, they begin to expect cooperation. Once cooperation is expected, it begins to feel required. And once it feels required, it is no longer cooperation, it is obligation. This is how the shift happens, not through a declaration, through repetition. The men who came to help begin to stay longer. They begin to organize. They begin to notice inefficiencies. There are always inefficiencies. A path is unreliable. A settlement is poorly defended. A storage system is inadequate. A leader is inconsistent. These are not criticisms shouted from a distance. They are observations made quietly, often correctly, which makes them much harder to argue with, because the uncomfortable truth is that they are often right. The Baltic frontier was not a place of perfect systems. It was a place of adaptation, improvisation, and survival. And improvisation, while effective in the moment, does not always look impressive to someone who prefers structure. So the men who stay begin to improve things. A stronger wall here, a more regular system of supply there, a schedule, a duty, a pattern, and slowly, almost politely, the temporary becomes less temporary. A wooden structure that was meant to last a season is reinforced, then expanded, then repaired, then guarded, then expected. And one day, without anyone announcing that this was the plan, the structure is no longer optional. It is simply there. It has become part of the landscape. And like all parts of the landscape, it must be dealt with. This is where the Baltic world begins to feel the presence of something new. Not just more people, not just more trade, but a different way of thinking, a way that prefers permanence, that prefers clarity, that prefers to turn uncertain arrangements into fixed ones. And at first, this feels helpful, because clarity reduces confusion, permanence reduces effort. A fortified place means fewer nights spent wondering where to run. A guarded route means fewer lost animals. A regular system means fewer arguments. It sounds in theory like a solution, and for a short time, it is. But then something very human begins to happen. The men who organize begin to expect recognition, not just gratitude, recognition. They are, after all, providing a service, protecting routes, maintaining order, ensuring safety. It is only reasonable that this service be acknowledged, perhaps with a gift, perhaps with a contribution, perhaps with a small, regular payment. Nothing excessive, just enough to maintain the arrangement. And here, very quietly, the line is crossed, because a gift can be refused. A payment, once expected, cannot. And so, what was once voluntary begins to feel less so. People do not always resist immediately. They calculate, they weigh inconvenience against benefit. If the system works, if the routes are safer, if losses are reduced, then perhaps the cost is acceptable for now. That phrase appears often in human history, for now. It is a comfortable phrase. It suggests control. It suggests that one can always change one's mind later. One rarely does, because once a system is in place, it becomes easier to continue than to dismantle, especially when dismantling it requires confronting the very people who built it. And those people, by now, are no longer just helpers. They are organized. They are connected. They have begun to think not in terms of seasons, but in terms of continuity. They build not just for this year, but for the next, and the next, and the next. This is a very different kind of thinking. It is not the thinking of a raid. It is not the thinking of a temporary refuge. It is the thinking of something that intends to remain. And when something intends to remain, it begins to defend its own existence. This is when the companions become something else. They train, they coordinate, they operate not as individuals, but as a unit, a group, a body, a force. Not large, perhaps, not overwhelming, but consistent. And consistency, in a world of improvisation, is a kind of power. People begin to notice. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. These men do not leave. They do not dissolve when the problem is solved. They remain when there is no immediate danger. They build when there is no immediate need. They enforce when enforcement feels unnecessary. And this is when suspicion begins to grow, because the promise was temporary. The behavior is not. This tension does not erupt into open conflict right away. That would be too simple. Instead, it settles into the background, a quiet unease, a sense that something has shifted slightly out of alignment, that the river, the paths, the settlements, the very rhythm of life has been nudged in a direction that no one fully agreed to, but also no one has fully resisted. This is the uncomfortable middle, the place where systems are accepted just enough to function, but not enough to be trusted. And in such places, misunderstandings thrive. A request is interpreted as a demand. A delay is interpreted as defiance. A refusal is interpreted as rebellion. And once these interpretations begin, they tend to multiply. Because now there are expectations on both sides. The organizers expect compliance. The locals expect limits. Neither side fully understands the other's expectations. And so friction builds. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, like pressure in wood that has been bent too far, too often. And eventually, something gives. Not all at once, not everywhere, but somewhere. Someone refuses. Someone resists. Someone decides that the arrangement is no longer acceptable. And the men who came to help must now decide what they are willing to do to maintain what they have built, because by now, it is no longer just a temporary solution. It is a system. And systems do not like to disappear. They prefer to expand. They prefer to justify themselves. They prefer to become necessary. And if necessity cannot be proven, it can often be enforced, which is, in many ways, the moment when help becomes something else entirely. At some point, quite quietly, the men who stayed began to resemble each other, not just in purpose, not just in presence, but in appearance. And this may seem like a small detail, the sort of thing that does not deserve much attention, because clothing is often treated as decoration, a surface, a matter of preference, a way of passing time or expressing taste. But in places where nothing stays temporary for long, even clothing becomes a decision. At first, a man wears what he has, what he can afford, what he can repair, what he can carry without being annoyed by it. Clothing is practical, a cloak that keeps rain away, boots that survive mud, a belt that holds, tools, nothing more. But when men begin to operate together repeatedly under shared purpose, something subtle begins to shift. Difference becomes inconvenient. Sameness becomes useful. If you must recognize each other quickly, in confusion, in movement, in the uncertain light of a forest where every shape can deceive, then it helps to look similar. If you must act as a unit, it helps to feel like one. If you must be seen, it helps to be recognized. So perhaps at first, they make small adjustments, a mark, a color, a symbol, nothing formal, nothing enforced, just something to avoid unfortunate misunderstandings. Because in a place where paths twist and alliances are uncertain, the last thing anyone wants is to strike the wrong man. That would be embarrassing and fatal. So the mark remains. Then it repeats. Then it spreads. Then it becomes expected. And now, once again, something temporary begins to settle. A symbol that was meant to clarify becomes identity. A shared appearance that was meant for convenience becomes a boundary. You are one of us, or you are not. And the difference is visible. This matters more than it should, because visibility changes behavior. A man wearing something recognizable does not move through the world the same way. He is noticed, he is interpreted, he is judged. He represents something beyond himself, even if he does not fully understand what that something is yet. And over time, this shared appearance begins to carry meaning, not just practical meaning, moral meaning, spiritual meaning, because the men who came to help were not only organizing routes and building structures, they were also carrying something else. Something less visible, but far more ambitious, a belief, or perhaps more accurately, a system of belief. And belief, when combined with structure, has a way of becoming very serious, very quickly. At first, belief is offered, gently, persuasively, with the same tone that trade once used. This is better, this is true, this is the way things should be. It is not forced, not immediately, because forcing belief too quickly tends to produce resistance, and resistance complicates everything. So belief arrives the same way everything else has arrived, gradually, reasonably, with the suggestion that acceptance will make life easier. And in some ways, it does, because belief brings structure, it brings explanation. It brings a sense that the world is not just a collection of inconvenient events, but part of something ordered, something meaningful, something that extends beyond the immediate problem of whether one's cattle will still be present in the morning. That is an appealing idea, very appealing, especially in a place where unpredictability has become exhausting. But belief, once accepted, begins to ask things, not loudly, not at first, just small things, recognition, participation, adjustment, a change in habit, a change in ritual, a change in how one understands the world, and for some, this is manageable. For others, it is not, because belief does not arrive alone. It arrives with the men who organize, the men who stay, the men who build, the men who now look alike. And this is where something begins to harden, because when belief and structure reinforce each other, they become difficult to separate. To refuse one is to challenge the other. To question one is to unsettle the other. And so what began as assistance becomes expectation. What began as guidance becomes correction. What began as persuasion becomes something closer to insistence, not always violently, not immediately, but steadily. And here, again, we see the pattern. A small, practical adjustment becomes a system. A system becomes identity. Identity becomes obligation. Obligation becomes pressure. Pressure becomes conflict. Not sudden conflict, not the kind that explodes all at once, but the kind that builds quietly in the spaces between people. A refusal here, a hesitation there, a disagreement that does not resolve cleanly, a leader who accepts the new system, another who resents it, a district that cooperates, another that watches, and, beneath all of this, the same old habits remain. People still hide things. People still remember paths. People still keep animals close. People still calculate risk. Because no matter how organized the system becomes, the memory of instability does not disappear. It lingers and it interferes. Because trust, once broken often enough, does not return simply because someone has declared that things are now different. This creates a peculiar tension. The men who have organized themselves, who wear the same symbols, who speak with growing confidence, begin to expect consistency. They expect agreement. They expect compliance. They expect that their presence will be understood as necessary. But the people they are dealing with have been shaped by a different logic. A logic of contingency, a logic of adaptation, a logic that says nothing is permanent and therefore nothing should be trusted too completely. These two ways of thinking do not fit together comfortably. One wants stability, the other prepares for disruption. One builds for permanence, the other assumes that permanence is an illusion. And when these two meet, friction is inevitable. At first, this friction is small. A misunderstanding, a delayed response, a disagreement over what was promised. But because the system is now more structured, these small frictions do not remain small. They are recorded, remembered, interpreted. A delay becomes defiance. A hesitation becomes resistance. A refusal becomes rebellion. And once a refusal is called rebellion, the situation changes. Because rebellion is not something that can be ignored, it must be answered. And the men who came to help, who stayed to organize, who learned to look alike, who began to believe together, are now faced with a question they did not originally ask. What do you do when people do not accept the system you have built for them? Do you wait? Do you persuade? Do you adjust? Or do you enforce? This is not a question that is answered all at once. Different men will answer it differently. Some will prefer patience. Some will prefer firmness. Some will prefer to believe that the system only needs time. Others will begin to suspect that time is not enough. And in that suspicion, something else begins to form. Not just a group, not just a structure, but something closer to an order, a way of organizing people, belief and force into a single shape. A shape that does not rely on temporary arrangements, a shape that intends to remain. And once something intends to remain, it begins to prepare for resistance, not because it wants conflict, at least not always, but because it has learned that conflict arrives anyway, and when it arrives, it is better to be ready, which is, of course, exactly how everything else in this world began, as preparation, as caution, as something temporary, until it wasn't. At first, it is only wood. That is always how it begins. Wood is reasonable. Wood is temporary. Wood understands, in a quiet and cooperative way, that it will not last forever. It bends, it rots, it burns, it complains in the wind, it accepts repair without arrogance. Wood is the material of people who are not yet entirely sure what they are building. So they build in wood a wall, a barrier, a place to stand. nothing too ambitious, nothing that suggests permanence, just something to improve a situation that is still officially temporary. And for a while, this feels appropriate. The men who came to help have something to defend. The route is safer. The river is more controlled. The presence feels justified. People adjust. They always adjust. They bring supplies. They make arrangements. They begin to behave as though the structure is simply another part of the landscape, which, quietly, it has become. But wood has a problem. It does not pretend well. It reminds everyone that it is temporary. It creaks, it weakens, it burns, it requires attention, and attention is exhausting, especially for men who have begun to think in longer terms, men who no longer measure time by seasons alone, but by continuity, men who are beginning to ask not how to survive the next raid, but how to prevent the next 10. And this is where the first uncomfortable thought appears. What if this should last? Not for a season, not for a few years, but longer, much longer. It is a dangerous thought, because the moment something is intended to last, everything around it must change. A wall that lasts requires stronger materials. Stronger materials require more effort. More effort requires more people. More people require organization. Organization requires authority. Authority requires obedience. And obedience, well, obedience rarely arrives willingly. Still, the thought remains. And once a thought like that takes root, it does not leave easily. So the wood is reinforced, then replaced. Not all at once, not dramatically, piece by piece. A stronger section here, a better foundation there, a wall that does not lean quite as much. A gate that closes properly, which must have been a great relief to someone who had been complaining about it for years. And slowly, without announcement, the material changes. Wood gives way to something heavier, something less forgiving, something that does not intend to disappear. Stone. Stone does not pretend. Stone does not apologize. Stone does not ask whether it is welcome. It simply exists, and once it exists, it insists, because a wooden barrier can be understood as temporary. A stone wall is a statement. It says, without words, this is not going away. And people understand that immediately, even if they do not say it aloud, even if they pretend for a while that nothing has changed. They see it, they feel it, because stone changes the conversation. A wooden structure invites negotiation. A stone structure invites adjustment. And adjustment, as we have seen, is something people become very good at. At first, the stone is accepted the same way everything else has been accepted, cautiously, reluctantly, with the quiet assumption that perhaps this, too, is only for now. Perhaps it will not spread. Perhaps it will remain limited. Perhaps it will not change daily life too much. This is a familiar hope, and like most familiar hopes, it is not entirely correct. Because once stone appears, it multiplies. Not quickly, not obviously, but steadily. A second structure, a reinforcement, a tower, a place to store supplies, a place to hold prisoners, a place to watch, a place to remind. And now the system has a center, not a temporary center, a fixed one. And fixed centers do something very specific to the world around them. They attract, they organize, they demand. People begin to move in relation to them. Routes change. Decisions change. Priorities shift. The place that was once simply part of the land becomes the place that defines the land. And this is where the deeper change begins. Because a stone structure is not only defensive, it is administrative. It keeps things, records things, controls things. Even without writing, even without formal systems, it begins to act as a point of collection. Food is brought here, supplies are stored here, decisions are made here, and slowly, very slowly, the logic of the hill fort is replaced. Not entirely, not immediately, but noticeably. The old refuge was something people went to when needed. The new structure is something people must deal with all the time. It does not wait. It does not sleep. It does not hide. It stands. And standing is a kind of pressure, because a standing structure requires a standing response. Who maintains it? Who serves it? Who answers to it? Who benefits from it? Who suffers because of it? These questions do not remain theoretical, they become practical, and practical questions demand practical answers, which means obligation, more regular, more predictable, more difficult to avoid. At first, it is still manageable. A contribution, a duty, a task, something to keep the system running, because by now, everyone has accepted that the system exists, even if they have not accepted what it means. And here, once again, we find ourselves in that uncomfortable middle, the place where things function but do not feel entirely right, where the benefits are visible but so are the costs, where the promise of stability begins to look suspiciously like control, and yet life continues. Fields are still worked, animals are still tended, children are still born, people still complain, people always complain. But the complaints begin to change. They become quieter, more careful, because now there is something to complain about, something specific, something that does not move, something that listens in its own way. A stone structure hears everything, even if it does not respond. And people begin to measure themselves against it. Am I inside this system? Am I outside it? Am I protected by it? Am I controlled by it? These are not easy questions, and they are not answered quickly, because the system does not rush. It has no reason to. It is built to last. And when something is built to last, it can afford patience, which is, perhaps, its most dangerous quality, because patience allows expansion, not dramatic expansion, not sudden conquest, just small adjustments, a new expectation, a slightly larger demand, a clearer rule, a stricter interpretation. And over time, these small adjustments accumulate, until one day the world feels different, not completely different, just heavier, more structured, less forgiving, less flexible. And the people who once moved easily between path and refuge, between forest and settlement, between uncertainty and adaptation, begin to feel that movement itself has become more complicated, because now there are boundaries, not just natural ones, constructed ones, enforced ones, and enforced boundaries do not behave like trees or rivers. They do not adapt, they do not shift, they remain, and they expect others to remain in relation to them. This is the moment when a temporary solution has fully transformed. It is no longer solving a problem. It has become the environment. And once something becomes the environment, it is no longer questioned in the same way. It is endured, worked around, resisted quietly, or, eventually, confronted. Because even the most patient system cannot prevent one simple thing: people noticing. And once people notice, they begin to ask whether what was built for protection has become something else entirely, something that protects itself. It never begins with a rebellion. That would be far too clear, too decisive, too easy to understand. Instead, it begins with hesitation, a small one, the kind that can be explained, the kind that can be forgiven, the kind that, if everyone behaves politely, can be ignored. A man is asked to bring something. He delays, not refuses, not directly, just delays. Perhaps he was busy. Perhaps the weather was poor. Perhaps the animal was lame. Perhaps he did not hear the request properly. There are always reasons, reasonable reasons. And in a world that has learned to live with inconvenience, reasonable reasons carry weight. So the delay is accepted. For now. That phrase again, for now. Then it happens again, in another place. Another man, another small hesitation, not refusal. Just less enthusiasm than expected. And at first, this is barely noticeable, because systems are patient, they allow for error, they expect irregularity, especially in lands where irregularity has always been the rule. But then the pattern begins to repeat, and repetition, as always, changes the meaning. A delay becomes a habit becomes a signal becomes a problem, and now something that was once dismissed begins to attract attention. Why are people slow? Why are they less willing? Why do requests feel heavier than they should? The men who organize begin to notice. They compare, they observe, they remember. And because they have built something that depends on consistency, inconsistency becomes visible, and visible inconsistency becomes uncomfortable. This is the beginning of tension, not conflict, not yet, just discomfort. A system that expects cooperation is met with something softer than resistance, but harder than agreement, hesitation. And hesitation is difficult to confront because it can always be explained, it can always be denied, it can always be softened into something harmless. I meant to. I will soon. These are not the words of rebellion, they are the words of someone who is not ready to obey fully, and that is much harder to deal with, because force, applied too early, looks excessive, but patience, applied too long, looks weak. So the men who built the system must choose how to respond, carefully, slowly. At first, they ask again, more clearly, more firmly. The request becomes a reminder. The reminder becomes an expectation. The expectation becomes something closer to a requirement. Still not quite a demand, but close. Enough that people begin to feel it. And feeling, once again, changes behavior. Because now the hesitation carries risk. A man who delays once may be ignored. A man who delays repeatedly begins to stand out. And standing out in a structured system is rarely comfortable. So some people comply more quickly, more visibly. They adjust. They always do, because adjustment is easier than confrontation. Others do not openly, not boldly, just enough to remain slightly out of alignment. And this creates a strange landscape, one where everything appears to function, but nothing feels entirely stable. The system continues, the walls stand, the routes are used, the obligations are met, but not cleanly, not willingly, not fully. There is friction in everything. A conversation that ends too quickly, a glance that lasts too long, a silence that feels deliberate. These are not acts of war, but they are not peace either. They are something in between, and that in between is where things begin to gather, because hesitation spreads, not through speeches, not through declarations, but through observation. One man sees another delay. He remembers. Another hears that a request was ignored. He considers. A third notices that nothing terrible happened after a small act of non-compliance. He learns, and slowly, without coordination, a pattern emerges. People begin to test the system, gently, carefully. They push a little, then step back. They delay, then comply. They give less, then more. They watch, always. Watching. Because in a world shaped by uncertainty, watching is survival. And now, for the first time, the system itself becomes something to be tested. This is new. Because until now, the system has been something to adapt to, something to accept, something to work around. Now it becomes something to measure. How far can it reach? How quickly does it respond? How much does it tolerate? These are dangerous questions because they do not have fixed answers. They change depending on who is asking, depending on who is enforcing, depending on the moment. And inconsistency, once again, becomes the problem. If one man delays and nothing happens, and another delays and something does happen, then the system appears uncertain. And uncertainty, in a system that claims to bring order, is deeply unsettling. So the response begins to shift, subtly, at first, a firmer tone, a clearer instruction, a reminder that the arrangement exists for a reason, that cooperation is expected, that delays are noticed. Still not a threat, not exactly, but something close. And now the hesitation becomes more meaningful, because it carries consequence. Not always immediate, not always predictable, but present. And this is where the first real divide begins. Not between large groups, not between entire tribes, but between individuals. Between those who decide that compliance is safer and those who decide that it is not. Between those who see the system as protection and those who see it as pressure. Between those who adapt and those who begin, very quietly, to resist. This resistance is not organized, not yet. It does not have leaders. It does not have a plan. It does not have a name. It is simply a collection of small decisions. A refusal here, a delay. There, a missing contribution. A quiet conversation in the wrong place. A shared look that says more than words. These things do not look like rebellion, but they are the beginning of it. Because rebellion, like everything else in this world, begins as something temporary, something uncertain, something that could still be avoided, something that people tell themselves will pass for now. And yet, it does not pass, because the system does not retreat. It continues, it strengthens, it expects. And expectation, when unmet, begins to demand a response. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. And so the quiet tension remains, growing, layering itself over daily life, settling into conversations, into decisions, into the way people move, speak, and choose, until one day, somewhere, someone decides not to hesitate, not to delay, not to soften, but to refuse, clearly. And once a refusal becomes clear, it can no longer be mistaken. It must be answered. And that answer, when it comes, will not be quiet. It does not begin with a grand declaration. No one gathers in a wide open field to announce that the time has come. No banners, no speeches, no moment that feels important while it is happening. Instead, it begins the way most irreversible things begin, in the dark, with a few people who are not entirely sure they are ready, and a decision that feels both necessary and slightly foolish, because refusing quietly is one thing, burning something is another. There is a difference between hesitation and action. A delay can be explained, a missing contribution can be forgiven, A conversation can be denied. But fire is very difficult to misunderstand. So it begins with a thought, not new, not sudden, just finally heavy enough to matter. This cannot continue. It is a simple thought, almost boring, the sort of nah sentence that has existed in 1,000 places before anything interesting happens. But here, in this place, in this moment, it does not remain a sentence. It becomes a direction, a plan. If such a small, uncertain thing can be called a plan, because the truth is, it is not a plan, it is a reaction, a collection of people who have been adjusting, bending, waiting, and are now, for reasons that may not even be entirely clear to themselves, unwilling to bend any further. So they choose something visible, because invisibility has stopped working. A storehouse, a small structure, a place that belongs to the system, not the largest, not the most important, but enough to be seen, enough to be noticed, enough to say something that hesitation could not say. And they go at night, because of course they do. No one wants to explain this in daylight. No one wants to stand in front of others and argue for fire as a solution. Night allows for a certain kind of courage, a quieter kind, a more practical kind, the kind that says, if this must be done, it should be done quickly, and preferably without discussion. And so they move, not in formation, not as soldiers, just as people who know the ground, people who have spent years memorizing paths, avoiding attention, moving through spaces that do not belong to them in the open sense, but belong to them in the deeper sense, the remembered sense, the inherited sense, the sense that says, I know how to reach this place, even if I should not. And that knowledge, which once kept them safe, now carries them towards something else, toward action. The structure stands quietly, as it always has, unaware, or perhaps not unaware. Structures, in a strange way, always seem to expect what is coming. They gather tension, they hold it, they wait, and then, very simply, the fire is set. There is no dramatic pause, no moment of hesitation long enough to be remembered later, just the act, the practical, irreversible act. And then, for a moment, nothing changes. Because fire is patient. At first, it begins small, almost unimpressive. A flicker, a line of heat, a suggestion, and then it grows. Because wood understands fire better than anything else. It responds, it gives way, it feeds the process, and suddenly the small act becomes something larger. Light appears where there should be none. Smoke rises, movement becomes visible, and what was intended as a message becomes something else entirely, an announcement, because fire cannot be hidden once it decides to be seen. And this is the moment when everything shifts, not because of the fire itself, but because of what it means. The system has been challenged, not quietly, not indirectly, clearly, irreversibly, and that changes everything. Because now, hesitation is no longer possible. The line has been crossed. On both sides, those who set the fire cannot return to quiet resistance. Those who maintain the system cannot ignore what has happened. And so, for the first time, the question becomes unavoidable. What happens next? The answer does not arrive immediately, because confusion comes first. It always does. People wake, people look, people try to understand. Was this an accident? Was it carelessness? Was it something else? And then, slowly, the truth settles. This was not an accident. This was not weather. This was not chance. This was intention. And intention demands a response. The men who organize gather, they assess, they speak in quieter tones than one might expect. Because anger, at this stage, is less useful than clarity. Something has been done, something must be answered. But how? Too soft, and the system appears weak. Too harsh, and the system becomes something else entirely, something more obvious, something harder to justify. And yet, the presence of the fire has already begun that transformation. Because once force is used openly, even once, it introduces a new language, a language that is much easier to continue than to abandon. Meanwhile, those who set the fire do not celebrate. Not in the way one might imagine. There is no victory, no sense of completion, only awareness, a sharp, uncomfortable awareness that something has changed, that things will not return to how they were, that the quiet middle, the hesitation, the delay, the careful testing is gone, and what remains is something less forgiving, more direct, more dangerous, and still, life continues. Because it always does. The animals still need to be fed, the fields still exist, the same people who set the fire must wake in the morning and behave as though nothing has happened, which is, perhaps, the most difficult part. To act normally when nothing is normal, to speak carefully when words matter more than ever, to move through the same paths, past the same places, knowing that those places now carry new meaning. Because the structure that burned was not just wood, it was part of a system, and the system now is watching. Even if it does not move immediately, even if it does not respond at once, it is watching, and everyone knows it. This is where the world becomes sharper, where small actions carry larger consequences, where mistakes are remembered longer, where trust, already fragile, becomes almost impossible. And yet, for a moment, there is also something else, something quieter, something that feels, to some, like relief. Because hesitation has ended, the question has been answered, the system has been challenged, and whatever comes next will at least be clear, clear in a way that uncertainty never was. This is a dangerous kind of clarity, but it is clarity nonetheless, and it spreads, because news, like fire, does not remain in one place. It travels, along paths, through conversations, across rivers, from one settlement to another. Something was burned. At first, this is all that is said, then more details, then interpretations, then judgments, and slowly the hesitation in other places begins to change, because now there is an example, a proof, a possibility. If it can happen there, what else can happen here? And just like that, the small fire becomes something larger. Not because it spreads physically, but because it spreads mentally, because people begin to imagine, and imagination, in a place already shaped by uncertainty, is a powerful thing, more powerful than the structure that burned, more difficult to contain than the fire that consumed it. And now, the system must respond, not to one fire, but to the idea of fire, which is far more dangerous. At first, they do not rush. That would have been easier, cleaner, more satisfying. But systems that intend to last do not rush into reaction. They calculate, they pause, they consider not only what has happened, but what it means, because the fire, inconvenient as it is not the real problem. The real problem is what the fire suggests, and suggestions, unlike flames, do not go out on their own. So the men who organize gather again, inside stone this time, inside walls that do not burn, inside a place that was built precisely so that moments like this could be contained, understood, and answered without panic. They speak, not loudly, because loudness suggests uncertainty. They speak with the calm tone of people who believe that control can be maintained if it is exercised properly. This is important because once a system believes it has lost control, it tends to overcorrect, and overcorrection is messy. So they choose restraint at first. The response must be measured, limited, precise. It must address the problem without creating a larger one, which is, of course, a very reasonable goal and very difficult to achieve. So they begin small. An investigation, a question asked here, a visit made there, nothing aggressive, nothing that looks like punishment, just attention. And attention, in a place already full of tension, feels heavy. People notice. They always notice. Who is being asked questions? Who is being watched? Who is being visited more often than before? These are not actions that can be hidden, not completely. And even if they could, people would still feel them. Because by now, everyone understands that something has changed. So the system looks and the people feel looked at. And this alone begins to shift behavior. Some become more careful, more compliant, more eager to appear, uninvolved. Others become quieter, less visible, less cooperative, because attention, once applied, does not affect everyone the same way. It sharpens some, it hardens others. And this is where the first mistake begins. Not a large mistake, not an obvious one, just a small miscalculation. The system assumes that attention will restore order, that by identifying those responsible, by applying a limited response, things will return to balance. Because that is how systems prefer to work: cause, response, resolution, a clean sequence. But the Baltic world has never been clean, and so the sequence does not behave as expected. The investigation produces answers. Not perfect ones, not complete ones, but enough. Names, places, connections. And now the system faces its first real decision: what to do with those names. To ignore them would be weakness. To act too harshly would be escalation. So they choose something in between, which always feels reasonable at the time. A targeted response, a demonstration, a message. Not to destroy, not to conquer, just to correct. And so they move. Not as raiders, not as a loose group, but as something more organized, more deliberate. Men who move with purpose. Men who expect to be followed. Men who expect to be obeyed. And they arrive in daylight. Because this is not meant to be hidden. This is meant to be seen. The settlement does not resist immediately. Why would it? Then, resistance, as we have seen, begins quietly, not openly, not all at once. So there is confusion, conversation, an attempt to understand what is happening, why these men are here, what they want, what they intend to do. And for a moment, it still feels as though this might be resolved, that words might be enough, that the system might simply remind, correct, and leave. But systems do not travel for conversation alone, not at this stage, because something has already been done, something visible, something undeniable, and so the response must also be visible, not overwhelming, just enough. A structure is taken, not burned, occupied, controlled. A person is removed, not killed, taken. A message is delivered, clearly, calmly, firmly. This is not acceptable. This will not continue. There will be consequences. It is, in many ways, a restrained response, measured exactly as intended. And for a moment, it seems to work. There is no immediate retaliation, no open battle, no escalation. The system appears to have reasserted itself. Calm has returned, or something that looks like calm. But here is the problem. The response, though measured, is not neutral. It is remembered by everyone. Those who were directly affected feel it as pressure. Those who were not feel it as warning. Those who were uncertain begin to decide, because now the system has revealed something. It has shown that it will act, that it will intervene, that it will take. And once that is known, the hesitation changes. It does not disappear, but it becomes sharper, more defined, less forgiving. Some people accept this. They adjust. They comply more fully, because now the cost of resistance is clearer. Others do not, because for them, the response confirms something else, that the system is not temporary, that it does not intend to leave, that what was once presented as protection has become something closer to control, and control, once recognized, is difficult to ignore. So the resistance does not vanish. It shifts. It becomes less visible again, but more intentional, less hesitant, more decided. And this is where the second mistake begins. Not in action, but in interpretation. The system sees reduced visible resistance and interprets it as success, as stabilization, as proof that the measured response was effective, which is, again, reasonable and again, incorrect. Because what has actually happened is something more dangerous. Resistance has adapted, it has learned, it has become quieter, but more committed, because now it understands the system better. It understands how it responds, how it moves, what it prioritizes. And knowledge, as always, is power, even when it is incomplete, even when it is risky, even when it leads to decisions that will, eventually, make everything worse. And so the world settles again into that uncomfortable middle, where everything appears stable but nothing is resolved, where the system stands, the walls remain, the roots function, the obligations continue, and beneath it all, something grows, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, a readiness, a willingness, a decision that has not yet been acted upon, but will be, because now the question is no longer whether resistance is possible. It has already happened. The question is how far it will go and how far the system will go to stop it. At some point, the word stops being useful. Raid. It sounds small, temporary, almost manageable. A raid is something that happens and then ends. Something that can be answered. Something that fits neatly into the logic people prefer. You took, we take. You burned, we burn. And then, eventually, balance returns. That is how people like to think. But in this world, that word begins to lose its meaning, because what begins as a raid does not remain a raid for long. At first, it looks familiar. A group gathers, quietly, not announced, not formal, just men who have decided that something must be done. They move through the same paths, the same remembered routes, the same knowledge that once protected them, now used differently. They arrive, they take, they leave. Quick, efficient, practical, exactly as before. But something is different, subtly, at first. The target. It is not just a neighbour anymore, not just another settlement that has cattle worth stealing, not just a familiar rival. Now the target is the system, a storehouse, a supply route, a controlled crossing. Something connected to the structure, something that matters beyond one village. And this changes everything, because now the act is no longer local, it is directional. It carries intention. It says something larger than before, and the system hears it very clearly. So the response comes faster, less patient, less measured, because this is no longer a question of correcting behavior. This is a cur, a challenge. And challenges, once recognized, do not remain small. The next time, the system does not wait. It moves quickly. More men, better coordination, less hesitation. And the response is not limited to one place, because the system has learned something too. That action in one place spreads. So the answer must also spread. And now, for the first time, the pattern breaks. It is no longer one act, one response. It is many, overlapping, unfinished, a raid here, a response there, another action somewhere else, a retaliation that arrives too late, a punishment that arrives too early. Everything begins to lose its sequence. And once sequence is lost, control becomes difficult, because now no one is entirely reacting anymore. Everyone is acting at the same time, for different reasons, with different memories and different expectations. This is where the word raid becomes insufficient, because this is no longer a series of events, it is a condition, a state of being. People begin to live inside it, not between conflicts, but within them. A man leaves his home, not knowing whether he is traveling or participating. A group gathers, not knowing whether they are preparing or already involved. A decision made for protection becomes an act of aggression, and an act of aggression becomes, in someone else's memory, protection. This is how confusion grows, not because people are foolish, but because the situation no longer allows for clean definitions. And still, life continues, because it must. Fields are still planted, animals are still kept, children still learn paths, but now they learn them differently, not just as routes, as risks, as possibilities, as places where something might happen, or has already happened. And this changes the tone of everything, because repetition sets in. A place that was attacked once is watched. A place that was watched becomes tense. A place that is tense becomes likely, and likelihood, once recognized, becomes almost inevitable. This is how the same places begin to suffer again, not because they are unlucky, but because they are known, accessible, valuable, or simply symbolic. And symbolism, once attached to a place, makes it heavier, more important, more worth targeting. And so the landscape itself begins to divide, not into borders, but into memory, places that are safe, places that were safe, places that are no longer safe, places that never were. And these categories shift constantly, because no place remains one thing for long, and the people inside this shifting map begin to change as well, because now hesitation has been replaced, not entirely, but significantly, with expectation. A man does not ask whether conflict will happen. He asks when. A leader does not wonder whether he must respond. He assumes he will. A settlement does not prepare just in case. It prepares because it has already seen what happens if it does not. And here, something important is lost. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone can point to and say, this is where it happened, but gradually. The possibility of returning to the earlier state, to the quiet hesitation, to the uncertain middle, to the world where paths mattered more than walls, where delays mattered more than fire, where the system was still something new. That world begins to fade. Not disappear completely, just become less relevant, less possible, because now there is momentum, and momentum is difficult to reverse. especially when both sides believe they are responding, not initiating, because that is the final irony. No one believes they started this. Everyone believes they are answering something, a fire, a demand, a punishment, a refusal. And because of that, every new act feels justified, necessary, even reasonable, which makes stopping almost impossible. Because to stop would feel like accepting loss, or admitting error, or trusting that the other side will also stop. And trust by now is something no one has in abundance. So the cycle continues, not because anyone wants it to, but because it has become easier to continue than to end. And in that continuation, something else begins to form. Not just conflict, not just resistance, but a pattern, a structure of violence, repeated often enough to become familiar, expected enough to be planned, normalized enough to shape life itself. And once violence becomes normal, it no longer needs explanation. It simply is, like the river, like the path, like the wall, something that exists, something that must be dealt with, something that will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until something larger interrupts it. Something that does not belong to this cycle, something that does not adapt to it, something that seeks not to participate, but to end it, or to replace it entirely. Chapter 11. The Men Who No Longer Asked Permission. At some point, the scale changes. Not suddenly, not in a way that anyone can mark on a specific day and say, this is when it began, but it changes, the same way everything else has changed, gradually, quietly, until one day it is simply different. The groups that once moved like small collections of men reacting, adjusting, improvising begin to resemble something else entirely, not just organized, not just coordinated, but certain, certain in a way that does not belong to the forest, or the river, or the uncertain logic of survival that shaped everything before. This is a different kind of certainty. A certainty that does not ask whether something should be done, only how and when, and how efficiently. The men who wear the same symbols now move differently. They do not arrive as visitors. They do not behave as guests. They do not wait to be understood. They assume their presence. And assumption is a powerful thing because it removes hesitation. It removes negotiation. It replaces uncertainty with expectation. They arrive where they intend to be. They remain where they decide to remain. They build where they believe building is necessary, not because someone has agreed, but because they have decided, and decision, when backed by structure, begins to look like authority, even if no one has formally granted it. At first, this feels similar to what has already happened, a continuation, a strengthening, nothing entirely new, but the difference is subtle and important. Before, the system expanded in response. Now it expands by intention. This is the shift, small, easy to miss, but irreversible, because once something begins to act by intention rather than reaction, it no longer depends on what others do, it defines what will happen, and everyone else must respond. This is where the scale grows. The movements become larger, not dramatically, but noticeably more. Men, better equipped, more consistent, less improvisation, more planning, and with planning comes something else. Distance, not physical distance, but emotional distance. A man who raids for survival behaves one way. A man who moves as part of a system behaves another. He is less affected, less hesitant, less connected to the immediate consequences, because the action is no longer personal. It is part of something, something larger, something that justifies itself. And this changes everything, because now, when a settlement is approached, it is not approached as one place among many. It is approached as a point within a larger design, a place to be secured, controlled, integrated, not negotiated. And this is when resistance begins to change. Again, because the old logic no longer applies. The hesitation, the testing, the small acts, they no longer produce the same results because the system is no longer reacting to them. It is moving, regardless. So the people must adapt again. They always do. Some withdraw, move deeper, avoid, become less visible. Others resist more openly. Because now the difference is clear. There is no longer a middle, no longer a comfortable space between acceptance and refusal. The line, which once moved quietly, has become fixed. And once a line is fixed, people must choose where they stand, even if they do not want to, even if they would prefer to remain somewhere in between. That option has begun to disappear. And so the conflict changes shape. It becomes sharper, more direct, less forgiving, because now both sides understand what is happening, not fully, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to know that this will not resolve itself. Enough to know that what has been built will not simply fade. Enough to know that what is being resisted will not simply stop. And in this understanding, something else appears. Something that has been forming quietly for a long time. Something that does not belong to individual raids, or local responses, or temporary arrangements. Something that belongs to continuity, to permanence, to structure, war. Not as an event, but as a condition. Not something that happens, something that exists. And once war exists in this way, it changes the world around it. Everything begins to organize itself in relation to it. Routes are chosen differently. Structures are built differently. Decisions are made differently. Even time begins to feel different. Less like a series of moments, more like a long, unbroken movement. And within this movement, certain places become more important, not because they were always important, but because they are now necessary. A crossing, a fort, a route, a settlement that sits in the wrong place at the wrong time. And these places begin to draw attention repeatedly, because once something matters, it is rarely left alone, and so the pattern deepens. More conflict, more response, more structure, more resistance, until the distinction between beginning and continuation disappears entirely, and no one remembers what it felt like before this, before the walls, before the symbols, before the men who arrived to help and never left. That memory fades, not completely, but enough that the current state begins to feel normal, unavoidable, expected. And that is perhaps the most significant change of all. Because once something feels normal, it no longer requires justification. It simply continues. Like the river, like the path, like the fire that once seemed shocking and now feels almost inevitable. And in that inevitability, the final transformation takes place. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. What began as a series of temporary solutions has become something permanent. What began as protection has become authority. What began as hesitation has become conflict. And what began as conflict has become a world that does not ask permission, a world that no longer remembers how. There is a moment in every long conflict when something quiet disappears. Not the fighting, not the structures, not the men who organize and enforce and expand. Those things remain. They often grow stronger. What disappears is something smaller, something easier to miss. The memory of what came before. And once that memory fades, something very strange begins to happen. People are born into it. Not into peace that becomes war, not into a sudden change, but into something that already exists, already functions, already defines the world around them. And for them, it is simply normal. A child wakes in a place where walls are already there, not new, not impressive, just present, as ordinary as trees, as expected as cold air. They do not ask why the walls exist. They learn how to move around them, where to stand, where not to stand, which gate is watched, which path is safer. This is not knowledge that needs explanation. It is absorbed. Like everything else, a boy learns that animals are kept closer than they might be elsewhere. Not because he has been told that raids happen, but because this is how things are done. A girl learns that certain conversations stop when certain people arrive. Not because she understands authority, but because silence has a shape, and she recognizes it. They grow up inside patterns, patterns that were once decisions, once reactions, once temporary, now permanent, now unquestioned. And this is where something deeper changes, because when a world is inherited rather than created, it is rarely challenged in the same way. The first generation questions, resists, remembers. The second adjusts, learns, adapts. The third accepts, not completely, not blindly, but comfortably. Enough. And comfort, even in a difficult world, is powerful because it reduces the need to imagine alternatives. Why would a child imagine a world without this? Without walls? Without patrols? Without the quiet expectation that something might happen at any time? That is simply how the world is arranged. And so behavior shifts again, not in response, not in resistance, but in assumption. People plan their lives around conflict without thinking of it as conflict. It is just part of the structure, like weather, like seasons, unpleasant sometimes, inconvenient often, but expected. And once something becomes expected, it loses its sharpness. It becomes background. A man hears that there was a raid nearby. He does not panic. He adjusts. He considers routes. He checks what matters. And then he continues. Because stopping, every time something happens, would be impossible. So people learn not to stop. They continue, always continuing. This is how endurance becomes normal, not as a heroic act, but as a habit. And habits, once formed, are difficult to break, even when they should be. This creates a kind of quiet resilience, not the kind that stories celebrate, but the kind that sustains. People repair, rebuild, replant, replace, again and again, without expecting an end, without expecting resolution, because expectation has shifted, not toward peace, but toward continuation. And this affects everything: relationships, decisions, even identity. Because now, who a person is becomes tied to how they exist within this system. Are they inside the walls, outside them, protected, controlled, part of the structure, opposed to it? These are not abstract questions. They are lived, every day, in small ways, in quiet choices, in habits that no one explains anymore. And here, something almost invisible happens. The difference between survival and life begins to blur, because when a person has never known anything else, survival is life. There is no contrast, no alternative to compare against, no earlier version to return to. And this, in its own way, is the most complete transformation. Not the building of walls, not the arrival of men, not the spread of belief, but the moment when all of that becomes invisible, when it is no longer seen as change, but as reality. And reality, once accepted, becomes very difficult to challenge, because to challenge it would require imagining something else, something that no longer exists in memory, only in possibility. And possibility without memory is fragile, easy to dismiss, easy to ignore, especially when daily life demands attention. Food must still be gathered, animals must still be kept, structures must still be maintained, children must still be taught. Life continues, even here, especially here, and so the world settles, not into peace, but into something stable enough to endure, a stability built not on agreement, but on repetition, on adaptation, on the quiet understanding that this is how things are and will continue to be until something changes, not from within, because from within, this world now sustains itself. It continues, feeds itself, justifies itself. No, if it changes, it will come from somewhere else, from something larger, something that does not accept this pattern, something that will arrive, as others have arrived before, claiming to improve what already exists. And perhaps, for a time, it will, because that is how all of this began, with improvement, with usefulness, with something that made sense, for a while, until it didn't.